はい、とりあえず今イエレン、ジャネット・イエレン財務長官の演説、元エネルギーの維持です。今これ見てるんよ。おい、偽物か？言ったら
But when it comes to EU membership, I would say that this will mean full use of potential of Turkey and EU. This means
仕上げるアメリカ
stable,
宣戦布告したらもう他に法なくなったよ。
but this also means in the world scene,
今あんなのも
global
こうやって
actor of EU,
Secretary Yellen and
peace,
Mr. President.
bringing
Yes, we heard.
welfare.
設けられた特別の会場でさ
So I would say that in this case,
出る
membership
よ
case,
まあ
the outcome would be win, win, win. So win for Turkey, win for the EU, but also win for beyond. 宣戦布告したらもう送っとった。
You will have to define
You got
what you mean
illumination.
by Europe and the European Union having
はい、
its
次
own
が
army.
イルミネーション。
I do not think Europe needs its own army for what I would
これは
qualify as
ほん
the
ま
classical Article 5
権力。
NATO scenario.
次が
In
イ
other
ルミネ
words,
ー
in
ショ
the
ン。
conflict
場面あります。
with Russia.
あ、
But
もうす
Europe
ぐ出て
should
きます。次
definitely,
がイルミネーション。
European Union should definitely
あ
develop the
次が
possibility
イ
to
ルミネー
project
ションって。
hard power without the United States of America.
あ、次がイル
I
ミネ
can
ーション。
imagine a scenario in northern Africa where you have a combination
あ、まあ、だからね、
terrorism,
さ
climate change, migration.
Ah,
it's
yeah,
not part
buddy.
of Africa largely, where Boko Haram meets Al Qaeda, where Al Qaeda meets Daesh. In other words, it's not impossible.
なんかおかしい
Look
と思
at
っ
the
た
French
ん
and
だ。
what they did and are doing in Mali.
なんだこれ。
You would need to intervene militarily, and
なん
then
だこれ。
the European Union would be on its own. Second scenario, virtual but not impossible, when in the Balkans the demons of the past would raise again. And we should not repeat a situation like we had in the 90s
あ
of
あ、
the
こ
previous
の
century,
方、そう。
where finally Bill Clinton and the United States of America had to come in to stabilize the situation. I could think about the need for border protection, external border protection,
あ
with military means. You're a bit on the border here between the
あ、
military and the
ああ、こ
military
とや
police
も
gendarmerie
う、こういうことにしたら、まあ、もう。
In other words, if that is meant
ああ、やっぱ
by
り
President
ね、
Macron
あ
and Chancellor Merkel with the
あ、某国
European
の
army,
某テロリストども
I
が
get full
さ
of、them. What we should
Facebook
not
の
forget, by the way,
通報しまくってて、
is
そういう
that
ことでした
you。talk about European military intervention. That's why I like the
まあ、
qualification
だ
of
ね、
the
俺
European
に
army, not
閉鎖追い
much.
込まれるよな。
Is that there will always be
取られるよ。
national parliaments
もう、で
who
も
will
仕方ない
decide
よ、先
if
生。
those soldiers
関与し
will
てるの
be
に
sent
紛れ
into
もない事
harm's
実や。
way. So they will not, I hope, talk about a European command and a European parliament which decides this goes to the heart of the
も
sovereignty of
う、
nations.
こういう人
And
も
those
ないよ。
nations will want to decide themselves. I see the way out as presented by President Macron of France, the European Intervention Initiative, where you can build coalitions of the willing outside the EU institutions. You can build coalitions of the willing, which you will always need for such kind of military
お偉い
operations.
さん。
Advantage of a coalition of the willing is that after Brexit, you can keep Great Britain on board because they will not
これでも
be
ね、
a
長い。
member of the
も
European
う
Union.
1億以上の
At the same time,
言葉
PESCO,
使っ
the
てる
Permanent Structures
ボロ
Cooperation,
ッ
should
カス。
of course continue, important project, but rather bureaucratic and rather cumbersome. So that would be my answer to the question, does Europe need its
あ
own
あい
army?
うことでした。やはりこれでしょう。やはりビルダーバーグ。ああ、びっくりした。あ、これでは物足り
What can we do in order for democracy to
そう
survive?
いうことでした。
So I
も
would like
う
that to be
本物。
the main theme for our conversation, and I can simply leave it with
Well,
that
of course.
and ask you.
Well,
So
well,
what does it
still,
take, and what can we do?
Well, I should tell you first
what I've been talking to people about. So, my wife and I have been on a 100-city tour since January. And I've spoken to about 250,000 people over the course of that. In Australia and New Zealand, throughout the US and Canada. Some in Europe, mostly in the UK. I'm coming back here in March and April to some of them and the East. When I speak to audiences, I always watch people one by one. I never speak to the crowd. And I always listen to the entire audience. Because what I'm trying to manage when I'm speaking is to put everybody in the same place so that there's dead silence. Because if there's dead silence, that means that everybody's concentrating on the same thing. And everybody has come to a collective agreement that that thing is of substantive importance. And the most reliable means of silencing an audience of 2,500 people, regardless of where they are from the world, is to make a strong case for the relationship between suffering, meaning, and responsibility. And the case for suffering, I think, is quite obvious, because one of the things that I point out to my listeners is that life has a tragic element. We all are perfectly aware of that. And that we're subject to that as fragile and finite creatures. And that tragic element is amplified by the human proclivity for malevolence at a psychological level and at a social level. And that's the reality that we find ourselves confronted with eternally in some sense. And that the proper antidote to that is not the pursuit of happiness. And it's not even the existence of the individual rights that are part of the substructure of democratic society, but the willingness to accept voluntary responsibility for those preconditions and then working to rectify them. And the corollary of that is that it's almost inevitably the case that people find the meaning that sustains themselves through suffering and that enables them to be motivated sufficiently to constrain their own malevolence is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And it's surprising that a message that has that much weight, let's say, and that little frivolity, because there's no frivolity, let's say, in that, silences people. Can democracy survive? Well, first of all, if you ask the typical person in a democratic society whether they would like it to survive, the resounding answer to that is going to be yes. The people who are working to undermine it are a tiny radical fringe on both ends of the political distribution, let's say, with a disproportionate amount of exposure and power. And the people in the middle are lost in some sense without a uniting narrative. And a huge part of the narrative that has united democratic countries since their foundation isn't the doctrine of rights. And it's not the doctrine of individual happiness. It's the doctrine that the individual is the sovereign foundation of the polity and maybe of the cosmos itself, which is something that I happen to believe, given the important role that consciousness plays in existence itself, and that it's useful and necessary to call to people to remind them of their responsibility as sovereign individuals. And so I'm encouraging people to develop a vision for their life, to adopt full responsibility for themselves in a manner, and not in a manner that pertains specifically to their narrow self-interest or happiness, but to something that's much broader in scope, to think that
supports and serves the community. And for many young people, that's something they've never heard, is that we've made a very bad case, all of us, I would say, that each of these people, each person, has that sovereign responsibility, and that if they adopt it, that actually constitutes something of singular importance. And that's an old religious idea, in some sense, that each person has a soul, let's say, that is somehow a center of reality itself, and that needs to be manifested in life itself, and that if it isn't manifested, then something of tremendous value is not brought forward, and worse, and this is the end of the case, let's say, and worse, to the degree that that's not brought forward, then something hellish moves in to take its place. And people understand this sort of thing a lot more clearly than you might think if you explain it to them as if they might understand. And then it gives them a series of purposeness that straightens out their life. And so my sense is the way that you revivify democracy is by remembering its fundamental insistence that the individual is at the cornerstone of the state, and that everything you can possibly do to fortify the individual, simultaneously, the individual is the eyes of the state, is that where the living individual is the eyes of the dead state, and the living individual revivifies the state. And to the degree that we forget our concentration on the sovereignty of the individual, right, the divine sovereignty of the individual for that matter, then we undermine the foundation on which democracy is based. And then people look for alternatives. They search for meaning elsewhere in extremist movements of one form or another, or they collapse into a kind of nihilism that's completely counterproductive. And so, so that's been my experience.
So this morning we had a session on the future of mobility, and we actually discussed what does it mean for the auto industry and what does it mean for the cities. If you look at the auto industry, there has never been as much change as there is today. On the technology side, with connectivity, electrification, autonomous driving, on the social domain, with sharing, more urbanization and new ways of working, and also on the regulation side, where it's about emission control and standards, and also on regulation for managing congestions in the city. So we actually covered that. We also talked about what does it actually mean for the cities? How will actually the traffic evolve if you have more AVs and individual mobility through AVs? What would be levers to actually work on getting a mitigation on traffic, and basically how to deal with heightened traffic from autonomous vehicles? What would be the impact of actually sharing more cars, of basically having smaller or basically bus-based autonomous vehicles? And actually, how would you deal with competency-based pricing? How would you actually work as a city to make the whole modal